Patrick, and we're going to move to our next panel talking about Southern California's unique landscapes and challenges. And this is a great follow-up for our first regional meeting that we had here, where we certainly learned about the challenges, and now we're going to have an update on those. And I'm going to turn it over to Patrick, because I think you want to set some context on this.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, we learned a lot when we were here a year and a half ago. And candidly, before that meeting, we heard an earful from Southern California. In fact, there was an entire legislative hearing in Sacramento around the topic of Southern California needs more attention from, in particular, the state. And so we got that message, and we spent a whole day, as many of you know, a year and a half ago, walking through all the key issues down here, the challenges. And then we've spent the last year, particularly with our science team, developing a regional resource kit that we hope reflects as best as we can what we heard a year and a half ago. So I hope we can hear this morning how far we've come in the last year and a half, working closely with many of you as we move forward together. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we have Megan Jennings and Sean Battles, who's going to share with us over the next 30 minutes. Megan.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. There they are. Okay. I'm glad to be here today to open up the regional meeting talking about Southern California's unique landscapes and challenges. I'm going to start off with a bit of a recap of what we heard in Calabasas last year, and then talk a little bit about what it is we have to lose and how do we go about protecting it in the most efficient way down here. There we go. So as my colleague from the Forest Service, Nicole Molinari, described last year, our ecosystems here are not dominated by forests, but rather by shrublands, primarily chaparral and coastal sage scrub. Those are in light green on this map. About half of our landscape is dominated by shrubs, and another quarter to a third is dominated by the human footprint of the nearly 25 million people that live here, and that's in gray on this map. One thing we didn't talk that much about, though, was why these landscapes are so ecologically important. I'm a wildlife biologist, so of course I'm going to start out by showing you pictures of wildlife and plants. Southern California's diverse ecosystems host a huge range of plants and animals. We're in a biodiversity hotspot. It's driven by our geographic diversity. We have extremely high rates of endemism, with species found only here and nowhere else. And that's a really special thing for us. In fact, where we're sitting now in San Diego County, we have the highest mammal, bird, and plant diversity of any county in the United States. That's something really special. However, the juxtaposition of these ecosystems with those 25 million people creates some challenges, and we have over 200 imperiled species in this region. So here you can really see the full extent of the human footprint in gray. That has an impact on our ecosystems. Well, over 30 years ago, conservation leaders in our region got together and decided that we would lose much of this rich biodiversity to development if we didn't take a proactive approach to conservation and protecting these important habitats and species. So they began planning an ecological network meant to connect and stitch the pieces together within this sea of people. These were the state's first plans under the Natural Community Conservation Planning, or NCCP Act. You can see the footprint of this network in green, adding to areas that were already protected. And the crosshatching shows our forested areas. It's a relatively small area, but most of it is protected. Our shrublands, not so much. That's what they were working a lot to protect. So these plans were originally created to address the pressing issues at the time, which were habitat loss, fragmentation, human activity, all associated with growing development. Land use change, things like houses and roads were coming in. But now we're faced with the more pressing issue of the persistence of these protected areas in a functioning state under climate change and under altered fire regimes. Those are causing vegetation type conversion, which you can see in these pictures of the San Diego River watershed, where too much fire is driving shifts from shrubs to non-native annual grasses. I think there's a field trip about this. So what we're faced with are these dichotomous fire regimes with different issues. So in our shrublands, fires were once infrequent, 30 to 100 years or so, and high severity. Now, with many more people living in the WUI, we have too much fire, and there are places burning every 5, 10, 20 years. In our forests, fires were frequent but low severity. After a century of fire suppression, both on the land and among indigenous people, we now have forests that don't have enough fire. And so when we do see fire, it's high severity and stand replacing, and we're losing forests at a rapid rate. So what are the effects of these disruptions of fire regimes on these ecosystems? Well, in our chaparral shrublands, we see too much fire push shrub-dominated landscapes to convert to non-native annual grasses. This reduces habitat quality, watershed protection, and promotes more fires because grasses are light, flashy fuels and creates a feedback loop of a grass fire cycle. We can address this issue by focusing on reducing ignition so we have fewer fires at the wrong time, at the wrong place that are uncontrolled. In our forests, too little fire results in stand replacing fires when they do come, which threatens homes, converts forests to shrublands like you see here in Cuyamaca Rancho State Park after the 2003 cedar fire. It still doesn't look the same. This has resulted in reduction of habitat quality, watershed protection, and carbon storage. Here, we want to focus on reintroducing good fire to the landscape. So we can protect the value of these ecosystems, those that you see here, the ones that I've already mentioned, and many more, by better balancing wildfire risk and ecosystem resilience. But this balance is different in our different systems. For shrublands, there's a distinct trade-off. When we protect people and houses, it can cause unintended ecological consequences that worsen our resilience to wildfire. In forests, it's more straightforward, and we can more readily work towards win-win strategies. So let's dig in. Oops, sorry, there we go. So let's dig in and talk a little bit about shrublands. So our #1 strategy here is to reduce ignitions, to reduce the start and spread of fires that are unintended. We also need to focus on preparing communities, starting at the structure with hardening. That extends to creating defensible space up to 100 feet. And finally, we have strategic fuel breaks. These are a landscape scale strategy that should only be applied on a limited basis. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So these first two are a win-win for ecosystems and communities. The second two are where trade-offs and maladaptation can come in. So we'll go through each. We want to focus on ignitions to prevent the next fire. And when we look at ignition sources, we see there's not many natural sources of ignition like lightning. There we go, circled in blue there. But when we look at equipment and power lines though, we see that's where we see a large number of fires and acreage burned. And so the good thing about this is that we can map these. We know where they are. We can focus our attention on those hotspots, which you see in darker colors on the map, along things like roadways. And we can harden and reduce flashy fuels like grasses in favor of native herbs and forbs that stay green for more of the year and are less available to burn. Another field trip on this one. So to protect lives and property, we want to prioritize structure defense. These often start at the structure, particularly eaves and vent screens where embers can ignite during wind-driven fire. Studies have shown these are the vulnerabilities that result in structure loss. Beyond the structure, defensible space should be treated in zones like you see in this figure from the County of San Diego, up to 100 feet. But this doesn't mean treating down to bare mineral soil, which you can see in this picture. And you can also find this all across our backcountry. That only increases erosion and creates pathways for non-native annual grasses, which dry out more quickly, are flashy fuels ready to burn at any time. Keeping well-trimmed natives are a better bet. I'll also add that I haven't heard much discussion at this meeting or the prior meeting about land use decisions. It's critical that it's part of the conversation. So we don't keep adding to the problem that we already have by building more homes in the backcountry in high fire risk WUI zones where we're continuing to cause ecological harm to protect structures. So finally, the most controversial approach in shrublands is fuel breaks. And not just fuel breaks, but strategic fuel break. So what makes it strategic in the first place? Well, they should lie in the path between known ignition sources and values at risk, creating a place for suppression forces to catch the fire before it spreads. We know where these places are. It's places where fires have always burned. You need to have people there. They need to be able to make a stand. So travel distance needs to be short and the location needs to be a priority and defensible. Fuel breaks also need, oops, sorry, there we go, travel distance and priority. And then they also need regular maintenance, and this is often what creates an issue. What you see in the photo here is the main divide fuel break on the ridge of the Santa Ana Mountains above the communities below in the distance. The goal here is to convert from shrubs to grasses, but you have to regularly treat. Otherwise, you've just created a wick for the next fire. Overall, it's really important to note that when treating these fuel breaks, the trade-off is that there's a net ecological loss, and your chances of successfully stopping the next fire are low if you don't meet these criteria for strategic placement across the landscape. So now let's take a look at managing wildfire and resilience in our forests to wrap this up. So over the last 3 years, I've been part of a team working to develop a conservation strategy to guide restoration and protection of our montane forests in Southern California. Much of the teams here today, from the Forest Service, the Climate Science Alliance, the USGS Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, raise your hands. You can find us, and there's materials out on the table so you can learn more and sign up for when we release this strategy later this month. So our goal with the strategy has been to find common ground to move forward in managing our region's forests, which are the canary in the coal mine for the rest of the state. The strategy focuses on all lands and partnerships and collaborations, what you've been hearing from the task force already, because the impacts of fire and climate change don't stop at fence lines and boundaries up on the map, and we need to work together to increase the pace and scale of the treatments needed to retain these forests. So then the strategy lays out 3 pathways towards forest resilience. The first is prioritize, so we address the parts of the landscape that most need protection first. The second is to plan to adapt to changing conditions by incorporating climate smart strategies into project design. And then finally, there's a tool to work through reforestation plans, considering that what was once on the land may no longer be able to persist into the future. So to guide the use of the strategy, we've identified 3 processes. We've workshopped with many of you already, so thank you to those of you who have participated in these workshops. First, we look at exposure to threats, the parts of the landscape we can't change that affect exposure to drought, susceptibility to fire, such as being on a steep south-facing slope. We're not doing anything about that. Then we consider vulnerabilities that we can change with management, things like stand density or ladder fuels. Together, these first 2 help us characterize risk on the landscape. Then we can identify areas of important resources to managers or practitioners that you want to protect. Where the risk is high and there are important resources, we'll want to phase treatment early before the forest is lost. We tie this prioritization to project level strategies by considering whether you're trying to resist change with minor interventions, accommodate change with more substantial management action, or transforming in the face of change to preserve overall functioning, but with a system that might look pretty different. It's also important to be realistic about the fact that there may be some places that we lose before they're burned and they look different than they've ever looked before. And we need to be proactive about those decisions. So let's go back to a similar list to what we did for the shrublands. And we can consider ignitions, thinning, fuels treatments, bringing good fire back, as well as reforestation and fuels. So ignition reduction helps us prevent fires under the wrong conditions before we're ready. Thinning and fuels reduction, there we go. Thinning and fuels reduction helps get the forest into a more resilient, fire resilient state. So then we can get to our ultimate goal, number 4 there, which is getting good fire back on the landscape. When fires do threaten permanent forest loss, we can consider reforesting, but with caution that we're not looking backwards to what was so much that we're restoring forests that aren't resilient to new normals. And finally, strategic fuel breaks can also be used in forests, but if we've managed appropriately, we don't need them. So let's wrap up with a quick side-by-side recap of where we want to focus our attention to enhance community protection and ecosystem resilience. That's the balance we're trying to strike. Ignition reductions are important wherever you are, and particularly in shrublands. We're still starting too many fires that are unintended, and we need fewer. Home hardening is important as well, but also regardless of where you are, we want to be doing this. We want to make sure we support people in making those modifications to your structures. Glad to hear about that from the task force. Defensible space, also important, but targeted immediately next to the structure and done in a way that includes native vegetation and with more good examples for people to follow that isn't down to bare mineral soil. Thinning, fuel reduction, prescribed burning across the broader landscape is really only needed in our forests. We shouldn't be promoting or undertaking these projects in shrublands, with the exception of targeted cultural burning, which you'll hear more about from my friends and colleagues this afternoon. And finally, strategic fuel breaks. It's a tool in the toolbox, but should be deployed to a limited extent with careful evaluation of the factors that make it strategic. If it doesn't pass that high bar, don't do it. If we focus on these targeted approaches for different systems and fire regimes, we'll be that much closer to protecting our forests, our watersheds, and our shrublands for the greater benefit of our region's rich biodiversity and our local communities. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Megan. That was super interesting. Now we're going to turn to a little bit nerdy approach. We're going to give an update on the regional resource kits. Okay. There you go. Great. So you've already got a quick introduction to the regional resource kits from Practic Right. Oops, back it up. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Right. So again, they're a consolidated set of tools. And just to give you an update on what they were, the goal again is again to accelerate action. They're designed to go out there and make this information you need more accessible. I call it the information infrastructure. And our goals are, again, to help you plan treatments faster, to monitor your progress faster, and to report outcomes faster. And so we go forward with that, and that gives us the insight to get this thing going on the ground. I don't see the slides. Sorry. Okay, well, we've been going at this for 2 years. We started, one of the core things we have to do is we start, thank you. All right. Okay, go to the next slide. This thing doesn't seem to be working. There we go. Perfect. Right there. Right. Great. So we started this 2 years ago. We start with what we call pillars of resilience. I don't need to go through the pillars, but my colleague Pat Manley describes these really well as value statements. What do we care about? We care about protecting communities from wildfire. We care about conserving biodiversity. We care about protecting our water supply, et cetera. So these values are our goals on the landscape, and we organize our information around that. One of the key parts of organizing this information is to get the data together. These are what we call the metrics. And the task force charged an interagency panel 2 years ago to start pulling these together and to deliver them every 4 to 5 months to each region. This was an effort led by Peter Stein and Carol Clark from the California Wildfire Institute, the Climate Wildfire Institute. And every 4 to 5 months, we went and delivered what we called our phase 1. After we finished the last one in Northern California, we went back and over the last 4 months or so have been doing updates and improving them. And so I want to give you a couple of ideas of what we've done with the improvements. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. Great. So one of the most important ones that you'll see right now is that when we released it in April is that our colleagues from UC San Diego went and updated the website. It's really a model of elegant and easy access to all these data. You go on our website, you get to this page, and you can see all of the data available. You can see the metadata. You can see quick maps of what they look like. So this is really, again, this idea of making it easy and easy to find. As Patrick mentioned, we've also improved the metrics going forward. Again, we heard that we didn't have enough for the Southern California. It's a challenging, diverse ecosystem. And one of the things we concluded was from Emma Underwood and her colleagues, a really expansive and informative data set about the functional ecology of the different shrub communities out here, whether they're obligate cedars or whether they're sprouters after fire. These are super important for how we sort of manage the response to fire. So it's a valuable data set that's been updated in the new kit. We also know that even though we want to put things by region, that sometimes there's landscapes out there that cross the regions. So there's a huge effort to go and harmonize all of the information we have statewide. So if your region tends to be if your landscape tends to cross a couple of different regions, you can use it. The Los Padres National Forest is a good example. It's both in the central coast and the southern coast. And so we can put those together now and get those metrics so they're harmonized and consistent. And probably most importantly, we really need to revise and refresh the metrics that we have. We can't let these get old because we need to monitor progress. And so it was really encouraging to see my colleagues from the Center for EECS. They were here today. Mike Goulden from UC Irvine is the lead. They built on funding from the Strategic Growth Council and now have this UC-powered sort of system that goes and gets metrics out there fast. He's here. You can go and download and see those new metrics. But the ideal is that we've got them updated to 2023 going forward. Now, there's other aspects to what we do in the resource kits. I want to give a quick, again, the metrics are central. They're central to the assessment and priorities. They're central to the decision support, and they're central to evaluation and monitoring. But I just want to give you an idea of these other tools going forward. As Patrick mentioned, for each region, we produce these regional profiles. These regional profiles have two aspects to them. We ask the community what your values were, what was important to you. You see that on the right. And then this assessment tries to give a starting point for everybody working in Southern California of what's the current condition of your resources. So these are out there to help sort of speed assessments and set priorities. We also have, again, as you said, we have this project tracking system of project inventories. You can find out what's going on in your neighborhood. You can strategize, you can collaborate. Again, wildfire doesn't know jurisdictional boundaries. Our treatment shouldn't know jurisdictional boundaries. And this kind of information helps you figure it out. We've also mentioned today that we have a decision support tool that's really important. That's a way of helping you use all this information. And then the Planscape Cooperative just released their planning tool for Southern California. Rob Lawson is here today. He's happy to give you a demo, track him down. But this, again, the idea is to help you go and start planning faster. We want to make this information easy to find, easy to use, and all of this information is open source and free to use. And of course, we also need to go and develop a monitoring and evaluation system going forward. And there's been a lot of recent progress in this area. Now, this progress is coming from all of these partner agencies working together for the U.S. Forest Service, CAL FIRE, and the California Natural Resources Agency. I'll give you a quick briefing of what they're going to do, what they're doing right now. As Jennifer mentioned, the U.S. Forest Service's broader scale monitoring and reporting system is going to be released tomorrow. This is a powerful dashboard that takes together all of the metrics for each of the national forests in California. You can go and you can look at the data, you can look at trends over time, you can look at the status, and it's more than just data. There's also a link on this dashboard that also gives you a state of the environment for each forest. It gives you a written summary of what's going on in each one of the forests. And the U.S. Forest Service is committed to updating this at least every 5 years. So we're going to have this monitoring strategy going forward for large segments of our landscape going forward. This is an effort, again, led on the region by Stephanie Capetto. It's really a marvelous tool, and it's going to be released tomorrow. So go look at it. CAL FIRE, the Fire and Resource Assessment Program, produces these every 7 years. They produce these forest and rangelands assessment. Their most current one is coming out this summer in 2024. It is chock full of super valuable information going forward. There's a couple of key points that I've seen that they've already begun to share. One is this one on the left here. Point number one is that despite all the challenges we've had in the forest, the fire mortality, the insect and drought mortality, that over the last 10 years, our forests in California are still storing carbon. They're still doing that good work to remove greenhouse gases. You can see that with point one, we're still getting gains. If you look to the right here, the second graph, though, is showing that a large fraction, 20 to 25% of our forest is pretty dense, and there's a lot of competition out there. They're at risk of imminent mortality. So it's kind of a good news, bad news. But this comes out every 7 years. So we have a 5-year, we have a 7-year update going forward. These are valuable systems that provide us information on what's going on with our forests and landscapes out here. Sure. Thank you. And finally, the California Natural Resource Agency has launching this effort to really improve our metrics with a big effort to get remote sensing and good data. And the real goal there is that it'll be able to get key metrics that we need and update them more rapidly. So this is an effort being led by Loretta Moreno, and she's here again today, so track her down. This is an amazing use of resources that California has brought to bear. For example, They have done recent LiDAR across most of the state. This is super valuable information. That's a baseline for developing these sophisticated tracking system, remote monitoring systems that will allow us to update our information as fast as possible. Again, all of this is available on our website, is the task force website, and you can get access to all of this going forward. Thank you.
Megan and John, thank you so much for all of the presentation and the information. We got a couple of minutes if any of the exec committee has any questions they want to ask. Or any comments? Yeah, Don.
Megan, I have one question for you. I guess when you mentioned like the conversion of shrublands to annual grasslands, historically, I think a lot of what was shrublands based off of research, paleoclimate, all that kind of stuff, was that they were probably herbaceous, perennial grasslands mixed in. I'm kind of wondering, like, from your perspective, how do we like find a balance with that in this landscape?
Just a simple question, right, Don?
I like to ask questions,
I think that's a really hard one to answer. The spread of non-native annuals has really pushed a lot of perennials out. I mean, I think we should be striving to get more of those perennials back. That's part of what that ignition reduction strategy is trying to do, is to get back to some of those natives that are green more of the year and are part of our natural systems. And I think, one of the reasons to be thinking about how we protect our shrublands, the chaparral and the coastal sage scrub, is that's where we have a huge amount of biodiversity. So, there's a lot of species to be lost, plant and animal. And so I think it's trying to strike that balance with how do we manage with what we have and move towards something that's resilient, understanding that fighting the tide of non-native annual grass is a huge challenge. That's not a good answer, but it's what I got.
Great, Don. Thank you. I know we're going to wrap up pretty quickly. Joe, anything you want to add to that?
I have a few, but I don't have time. It is really, Megan, your comment around defensible space, so important. It is striking a balance. You mentioned home hardening around eaves and vents. And then you talked about defensible spaces. We know we talk a lot about ember resistant zones, the 0 to 5 foot that are still, moving forward. And it's important to just note that, from NIST reports, from work that have been being done there, that ember resistant zone is going to be so important to assist in that structure hardening. I guess a more complicated question, and I most certainly appreciate your expertise in this area, but it is around strategic fuel breaks, right? And my question really is, in your presentation, your strategic fuel breaks change the ecological benefits or the ecology of the area. So the question really is, from a scientific standpoint, do you believe that there's a greater or lesser potential of ecological effects by letting an unwanted fire burn through the shrubland because we don't have a place to place resources on an approaching head fire, versus a strategic fuel break that will allow for the potential placement of resources to reduce burning of shrublands by attempting to reduce ember cast ignitions? I think that that's a balance as well.
Just light topic again.
I don't know if there's a
For you
question
on
there
that
or
one.
not.
That's juicy.
What are your,
This is simple stuff. So, I think the point is about strategic. And that's where I come back to, is that if we are thinking about areas where we have always had fires, where we know there are ignition sources, where we have seen fire after fire, that's where the issue is. A single fire is not bad in chaparral, right? It's the repeated fires in those short intervals is where we have the issue. And so it's not a problem if something burns that hasn't burned before, but it's a problem if it's burning year in and year out, and we start to see that ecological shift. So I think we have to be asking ourselves those hard questions when we're talking about where we place fuel breaks. They have to be strategic from that sense, as well as some of these other senses, in terms of, are you going to get people there? When I worked for the Forest Service, I would say gut check time. Are you telling me you're going to put somebody there? If you say, yes, I'm with you. If the answer is no, then we shouldn't be doing it. You have to be able to get people there, because as we all know, fuel breaks don't work on their own. They work with people there to fight the fire.
Absolutely. Agree. Thank you, Megan.
Yeah,
And if I can, I know I'm, go ahead.
keep going.
I know I'm battling the clock right now, but for John Battles on that note, talking about monitoring and reporting. Again, I'm going to reference back to Assemblymember Petrie Norris asking me questions at a budget committee 2 days ago. And it is really around monitoring and reporting and having that information available. So maybe more of a statement than a question, but I just want to ensure, especially with the launch tomorrow and all the work that's being done by all the other agencies, it was important for her to relay that monitoring research and the reporting of that needs to be transparent and public, but not be so scientific that the layperson doesn't understand. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think that's the whole point with the core metrics, right? That you're gonna, there's hundreds of them that you leave it to the scientists, but if you work with the policymakers, you get the 20 or so that are really important and resonate with the decision makers. And that's the process I think the task force is launched. It's not finished yet, but that's the idea. You want scientifically robust, but they gotta be policy relevant. And that's a partnership that we're trying to do again with the task force, get everybody at the table and figure out what makes sense. So I think that's the goal.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Hey, Jen,
Yeah,
sorry.
please,
We
go.
gotta, we
Doug,
gotta
got
fight
time.
for our right to speak over here.
Get in
Uh,
there.
Super quick comment. Megan touched on development and, where do we place that? And so my request would be, maybe that's something we discuss at the task force in the future.
Great, thank you. Looking at other committee members, anything? Thank you, Doug. Get in there when you need that time. That's right. Throw it. So Megan, I really appreciate that process that you described too. Have we used it in the sense, and if we have, can you describe it? Or where is the appropriate place to have those discussions from your understanding?
The process for the Montane Forest Conservation Strategy?
Yeah, the ones where you described through. Yeah.
Yeah, so very fortunately, we have our friends and colleagues from the San Bernardino National Forest in the room. We've been piloting it with them. We worked with the Headwaters Resiliency Project, Inland Empire, RCD. We've had a lot of input and we've sort of been building this as we fly it. And that's been really great because we're receiving input as we develop it. And I think it's been really helpful. So we make sure that we're developing, right? We're not going too scientific and creating something that people won't use. We're working directly with managers to say, what do you need? What are your priorities? What are the vulnerabilities you're most concerned about? And how can we compile that in a way that helps you make decisions about where you want to do projects, how you phase your projects, and what kind of treatments you're doing in those projects with information behind you and justifications for what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Thank you very much. Anything else, you guys? Looking at colleagues? Well, I hope everybody realized, thank you, John and Megan, because there's a lot of data out there, as you can tell. There's a lot of information. And one of the key goals of particularly this panel and the task force is how do you package all of this to be transparent, to make sense, that anyone can pick up, to be able to develop, use, adjust, monitor as we go along. And so decision-making processes are part of that too. So I really appreciate Megan bringing forward the process that you've developed collectively. And then also all of the data that we have that we're really trying to package up in those resource kits with all of the monitoring and being transparent about that too. So yeah, go ahead.
Just wanted to give one more plug that those were our pilots and we're still
Yes.
moving across the landscape. So we're coming to you. We've done San Diego to start. We've started in San Diego. We'll be coming up to Angeles and to the South Coast, our North Coast in the Santa Barbara region soon. So stay tuned.
Thank you. Can we give a round of applause for John and Megan?